Welcome, everybody. I'm going to be just very brief because I'm not going to do the formal introduction of our distinguished speaker. That will be Tony's job. I'm Jim Murphy. I'm in the faculty of the Graduate School of Geography. I'd like to welcome you to this year's Atwood Lecture, our featured event every year for the department. And we're really pleased that you're here to be with us to hear our incredible speaker. Just before I put Tony up here, I just want to say organizing this event, as well as organizing the colloquium series, is a tremendous amount of work, particularly for one individual. And that individual is Kayla Peterson. So Kayla, can you stand up so we can give you a big round of applause? I can't tell you the amount of interference and logistics management and communications that Kayla handles, and these events would never really get pulled off in any way without that kind of support, so thanks, Kayla. Without further ado, I'd like to bring Tony Bevington to the podium to do the introduction for tonight's speaker. Thanks.
Hi, good evening. My name is Tony Bevington. I'm director of the Graduate School of Geography. And it's my honor and privilege and pleasure to introduce to you this evening our guest Atwood speaker for 2017, Arturo Escobar. Arturo is the Kennan Distinguished Professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of North Carolina. Prior to that, he taught at UMass Amherst, Smith, and UC Santa Cruz, and he's held named short-term professorships and chairs at Manchester, Oregon, the General San Martin in Buenos Aires, Iowa, and other universities. So Arturo's PhD is actually in development philosophy, policy, and planning from UC Berkeley. But what some of you may be less aware of is that his undergraduate degree, and this is for Jim, is in chemical engineering at the Universidad del Valle in Cali, Colombia, where he also did a year of biochemistry graduate work, and then from there went to Cornell to do a master's degree in food science. So, and I say that simply to say that there is a deep base of multidisciplinarity within Arturo's work and sustaining his reflections on the issues that he addresses in that work. For many of the older ones among us, maybe other of you as well, this was the case for me for sure, our first sustained engagement with Arturo's work was his 1995 book, Encountering Development, which for those of you who like metrics, I looked this up today, has now been cited just shy of 10,000 times on Google Scholar. And that's a book that really left a deep mark on development theory and thinking. And though it's a very critical, deeply theoretical book, it's also a book that's read by practitioners, as I've come to realize over the years. And in fact, the person who first introduced me to the book was a friend and colleague who then went to become International Director of Programs at Christian Aid, a large development NGO in the UK. I think many of the people who read that book, while they may have had disagreements with some of the arguments, they read it because, or they stayed with it, because it spoke to them, us, in new and creative ways about something that we knew, but it talked about them in a different way, that something was going very wrong in the nature of development. There was something wrong in the very DNA of the enterprise. What's also interesting about that book is, though it was a critique of development, it was based upon an engagement with the National Planning Department in Colombia, Departamento Nacional de Planeación. But Arturo's longer-term collaboration has been with social movements in Colombia, and especially with the Afro-Colombian communion movement, the Proceso de Comunidades Negras. And in some ways, as I was thinking about these notes and what to say, while Encountering Development really developed a critique of development as conceived from bureaucratic centers of power. This collaboration with the PCN has been all about exploring alternatives to that. Alternatives as imagined and as pursued by different movements across Latin America in particular. In addition to, along the way, Arturo also put together with colleagues a couple of landmark collections on the phenomenon of new social movements in Latin America, the making of social movements in Latin America in the early 90s, and later on a book that very much left an imprint on me, Cultures of Politics and Politics of Cultures. And of course, there's a series of books in Spanish that I won't cite here. The book that, and I'm wrapping up now, but the book that brought together the collaboration, at least this is as I read it, with the PCN, was a book that I know several of us here teach with, which is called Territories of Difference. And that, again, I take it as to be an effort by Arturo and the PCN together, the social movement together, to theorize what the movement was seeking, or is, because it's an ongoing process and struggle, seeking to achieve as an alternative in a context that was difficult, characterized by paramilitary violence, expansion of oil palm cultivation, the narco-economy, and so on and so forth. And it's a book that really sits at that space where geography and anthropology meet and overlap, or one of the spaces where we overlap. The book's organized around concepts of place, development, nature, capital, identity, and networks. Those are the chapter titles. Very much keywords of your classic human environment geographer, keywords of a political ecologist. But beyond the theoretical elaborations in Arturo's work, and this is where I want to wrap up, I was trying to think of my own keywords of what characterizes Arturo's project to me, and I have three that I want to share. The first one is solidarity, because when you read Arturo's work and when you hear him speak, as you'd say in Spanish, no hay donde perderse, it's so palpably obvious that this work is done for a purpose. It's done in solidarity with certain principles about how society could and should be organized. So it's really, again, for me, I think, the quintessence of engaged scholarship, because it's deeply scholarly and it's deeply engaged at the same time. So my first keyword is solidarity. The second keyword is critique, because running through this work is a critical engagement that makes the work uncomfortable reading for many of us, because it challenges many ideas, and particularly, perhaps more importantly, many terms that most of us use, or many of us use, for much of the time in a way that we leave unexamined. And Arturo's work forces us to examine the terms that we take for granted, and forces us to ask what's going on behind those terms when we use them. So my second keyword is critique. But my third keyword is optimism. Because even if Arturo's project is deeply critical, it never, at least in my reading, stops being hopeful. It imagines other worlds, or at least it continues believing in the possibility of imagining these other worlds and of bringing them into being. And my sense, I might be wrong, is that today's talk, the 2017 Atwood lecture, falls within this same vein of critical optimism. Because a focus on design must surely imply a belief in possibility and difference. But now we'll see. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you all and to welcome to Clark and to the Graduate School of Geography a colleague and a friend, Arturo Escobar. Arturo.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here. And I want to start by thanking the School of Geography for inviting me to deliver this lecture. I know it's an important lecture in the department and in the profession, because it has a high visibility as well. I'd like to thank in particular Tony Babington, Jean Murphy, Miss Kyla Peterson for the wonderful arrangements that she made. And I agree with Jim that this is really has been her making from quite a few months back. So thanks to Kyla again. And the PhD students with whom I met today, 4 PhD students that were really, really exciting and bright and doing great work. And I'm sure the ones I'm going to meet tomorrow, the faculty with whom I met today for lunch and dinner, thanks to all of them for making me feel really welcome, and also my partner Magda, who's been with me most of the day. And when Tony was talking, I wondered if I should move away from it. Okay, let's see if we can get it working. Is this one working? Okay, when Tony was speaking about the third characteristic of what he sees in my work, which is optimism, which he's very right about. I was remembering something that Gustavo Esteva, one of the people with whom I work closely over the years, about the past 25 years, that says that hope is not the conviction that something will happen, but the conviction that something makes sense, whatever happens. And so I learned about hope probably since I was little, but also from the activists with whom I work, who cannot really live without hope, because living without hope would be totally giving up in situations that are very difficult. So I learned about hope also from them. So what I'm talking to you about today, what I'm going to be talking about today, is in many ways it's a new articulation of hope. And it's a hope that some of my friends are sort of cautious about, because it's a hope that has to do with the first word here in the title, which is design. And we don't hear too much about design in geography or in anthropology, or in the social sciences, because design is something that belongs to the design professions: architecture, industrial design, graphic design, engineering, and so forth, arts. But the fact is that design has to do with everything. And everything, everywhere we look, the chairs, our iPhones, computers, cars, buildings, everything is design. And design is emerging. I started working on design again. I've been sort of thinking about design for a long, long time, but I really started working on design relatively recently in academic terms, which is about 7-8 years ago, when I started systematically reading about what new designers are thinking themselves, and finding there is a critical mass of designers that are thinking about design in super interesting ways, trying to redefine design completely from its conventional meanings, very much tied to capitalism and modernity and globalization and so forth, and objects and products, to a political technology, if you wish, to space for really thinking deeply about social change and social transformation to our sustainability. So that's why I came to think about design in these ways. And what I want to do is you notice that there's a change in the title in relation to the title that was announced. I included the word ontology there because I think central to what I'm doing is an ontological rethinking of design, and I will explain that in a moment. And of course, it's about autonomy and territoriality, which is the long-standing work that I've been doing for many years, that is more familiar to you as geographers, and that's the connection to geography as well. So to give you a quick sense about the talk itself, and I'm going to be talking about 50 minutes beginning now. So bear with me, please, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers, if you wish, about what does design have to do with the contemporary ecological and cultural crisis and social crisis that we face today, increasing inequality, ecological devastation, and so forth. And hence, why is design seen today as a potential space and tool for a transition, to a significant transition to a different model of social and political life and economic life? And then what I was talking about before, so trying to map the emergence of design as an important cultural political project from the writings of designers themselves. Not what anthropologists, geographers, historians, philosophers, politicians are writing about design, but what design theories are writing about design itself. And then why an ontological approach to design? What does that mean? What does that mean? So I'll explain that in detail. And so the first half of the lecture is going to be these 3 points, because I want to give you a good sense about these new debates on design, since it's going to be new for most of you, unless there are some designers in the audience. And the second half is going to be more about the connection. How do we put together design and social movements? How do we put together design and territorial struggles, the struggles of territory and place? They don't seem to go together, do they? And yet my argument and my own take about rethinking design is that design can be reoriented to become a tool for radical struggles for autonomy by communities. And that to do that, we have to engage in a significant rethinking and reorientation of design from its functionalist, commercial, capitalistic orientation towards a more non-dualist, relational, sustainable kind of conception of design. And so that's what I'll be doing in part 4. Okay, and beginning with, sort of a sense of how design is conventionally understood. When we think about design, we usually think about products and services, objects. There is the iconic objects like the brown toasters. This is mostly sort of the golden age of design, modernist design, 1940s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. Toasters, the great products of the Italian bell design, like the Olivetti typing machine, the beautiful Vespa, created in 1946. This is from 1953. Scandinavian furniture. This is one that we find particularly comfortable. It's a very nice design. Obviously, the Macaire, who can forget the Macaire? I remember when it came, the hoopla about the Macaire, the sort of the utopia of design, beautiful design. Architecture, the architecture of the suburban homes with the 2-car garage and so forth. So this is what people usually have the idea when we think about design. Okay? Still, so it's technocratic, it's market-oriented, it's very much embedded within capitalism. There is a famous definition by Herbert Simon, 1957, I believe, where he says, design is devising courses of action aimed at changing existing conditions into preferred ones. So it's not really about objects, but objects have something to do with it, but it's really about transformation. It's about planning, about social engineering. All of that is part of the background of design. It's a fundamental political theory of modernity. Modernity cannot be thought without design. Design is about modernity. Design, in a way, modernity in a way is a design project. It's a driver of sustainability and the futuring. So design is central to the ecological and social crisis that we're living today. At the same time, I'm saying this kind of crazy thing, that we can use it in a way as part of the solution. So is it possible? And designers have this idea that design is everywhere. Everything we do has to do with design. Again, it's ubiquitous. With computers in particular, has become so. And that we can do anything. We can design anything. So some people are sort of thinking we can design our way out of the crisis, but the most interesting thinking is not along those ways, but it's very different. It's very, very, very different than that. So this is the famous quote by Bruce Mao, a designer and theorist and practitioner in Toronto, that design, massive change is not about the world of design, it's about the design of the world. So how can we redesign the world? How can we redesign the human even? So these are bold claims that some of these design thinkers are making. So how does design emerge as a cultural political project? First, it has to do with what Bruce Mao was talking about. Design is moving into all kinds of different domains, social domains, cultural domains, political domains, health, education, you name it, design is there, and designers are there at work. The fact that, and this is from Ezio Mancini, Italian designer from Milano, really great work, fascinating, very sophisticated social theory also work. When, communities used to design in traditional way. Nobody called it design, obviously. So communities in a way didn't design explicitly, but then now this idea that we're all designers, I mean, we're designing our own lives, and we do when we choose college, when we choose what to do in our own lives, in a way we're designing that life. But that today, because traditions are being weakened, we can no longer rely only on those traditional mechanisms, and design has to become a combination that uses those traditional ways, but also many kinds of new ways. And so taking the design out of the studio, so to speak, and design becomes, and these are some of the new keywords, user-centered, situated, interactive, collaborative, ecological, focus on the production of life itself. So two very sort of catchy categories that are coming out is design thinking. Many of you have heard about design thinking by now. It's a particular way of thinking about life and about how life is designed and about sort of key elements that go on into any kind of design project, but also co-design. Co-design is one of the most exciting things. It's a kind of collaborative design where the design expertise is no longer just with the expert, is distributed throughout the whole community or throughout the whole social body. And again, everybody in a way becomes a designer. But how about politics? In most of the writings of these designers, politics is not foregrounded. Questions about power are not really addressed. So we'll talk about that a bit later on. So a whole bunch of design books about design thinking, about critical design and futures. Design anthropology is becoming a booming field. Less so in geography, even as there is geodesign. But geodesign is a more technical field. But in geography and anthropology, political philosophy, people are talking a lot about design. And this little book that I just put here by a guy, Arturo Escobar, this is the book that came out in Spanish about 6 months ago in Colombia. It's in conversation with all of these different trends in critical design studies, as I call them. The book in Spanish actually is called Autonomía y Diseño, la realización de lo comunal, Autonomy and Design, the realization of the communal. And I'll explain that. The title is very precise. In English, it's going to come out in about 8 months with a different title, which is Designs for the Pluriverse, Radical Interdependence, Autonomy, and the Making of Worlds, And that's also accurate in a different sense. But the real sort of interlocutors for the work that I've been doing comes mostly from these 3 books. These are sort of the 3 main ones. The Ezio Mancini's book from 2015, Design When Everybody Designs. This one by Terry Winograd and Fernando Flores may be in the question and answer period. I can tell you much more about this book. A book from 1986, Understanding Computers and Cognition, when they coined this concept of ontological design. And they outlined the concept in a couple of chapters of the book that has mostly to do with computers, but they didn't develop further. And that notion of ontological design stayed with me always until I decided to pick it up again about 8-9 years ago. And this is what I've been doing now. And so, for instance, Mancini gives a definition of design, which is a reworked definition from Herbert Simon's definition. Remember, design is a culture and a practice concerning how things ought to be in order to attain desired functions and meanings. So he's not talking about design is the production of. Design is a cultural practice. It's a political cultural practice. And this is the awareness that I find that is so interesting in design thinkers today. Or from Winograd and Flores, they define design as the interaction between understanding or knowledge and creation. Design is a conversation about possibilities. Design is a conversation about how do we want to live? What kinds of worlds do we want to create? What are our desires? Design is about all of those different things today. And from Tony Fry, Australian designer, who said that design is one of the key and defining attributes of the human. We all design from the time of the first tools, from the first, humans, early humans, and so forth. And the design is a situated praxis that links the open dimension of technology with cultural practices. So again, emphasizing the cultural as well. This is from Mancini. This is a summary of one of his presentations on YouTube. And so Mancini begins with, we are going through a multiple crisis. It's a crisis of poverty, climate, energy, meaning, and a civilizational crisis. And many people now use the concept of civilizational crisis, particularly indigenous activists in Latin America, but also people like Mancini does. And we need to move towards a sustainable society, and this utilizing a different kind of social innovation that he defines in terms of new ways of living, new ways of producing, new ways of thinking. So again, new ways of living. We need to relearn how to live. We need to relearn how to be humans, because we're not doing it well. We're being humans at the expense of the earth and at the expense of each other. And then with emergent design, which is community-centered design with community, a new design culture. So all of this reconceptualization of design is what I find really exciting, as for us as social theorists and also as political activists. This is from a group in Boston, headed by a wonderful African-American designer, design activist, Kenny Bailey, Design Studio for Social Intervention. And this is one of the newer projects, the design of social emergency response centers. This is sort of a prototype. And you see, I mean, one of the things that I wanted to show you here is this sort of a screaming room when you have to have a screaming room where you can't take it anymore. So this kind of neat ideas about how to design spaces for people to come together to really think deeply about the current situation in the social emergency in which we are today, especially with the Trump era, and how we can sort of design in that context. So it's very nice. At Carnegie Mellon University, they are doing some of the most interesting work with these new ways of thinking about design. So design takes place within the natural world. Again, it's a relatively new thing from the ecological age. It builds the world, which is the world of infrastructure and buildings and objects and products and so forth. But it's also now adding design for service, which has been around for a while already within the existing paradigms. How do we provide services, health, education, etc., housing for people in better ways? Design for social innovation, which challenges the existing paradigms and tries to create a new paradigm for doing things. And finally, the most sort of radical, which is transition design, they actually have a PhD program on transition design, which is about creating the paradigms of the future, the paradigms that are going to really lead to a sustainable society. Okay, so the argument is very simple. So this is the argument of the book. Design has been a fundamental political technology of modernity and hence of unsustainability. To reclaim design for other world-making projects requires a renewed consciousness of this historicity. So basically, we have to go back and look at the history of design and really reinterpret that without its celebration, because design and the history of design has been celebrated continuously, and now see the underside of that design that has created these unsustainable cities, unsustainable societies, very unequal, and so forth. So that is part of the cultural stories of design. The most appropriate mode of access to the question of design is ontological, because again, if everything is on the line, if we are really at a very dire situation of crisis, maybe even civilizational crisis, then we have to go back to basic questions about ontology, about what kinds of worlds do we have? What is the world that we have? How can we design and come up with different ideas and different ways of thinking about the world and different ways of constructing it? So design, this thinking takes place in this civilizational conjuncture of crisis, and so is leading to a project of design for transitions, and a number of groups here and there are working on this. And the final for me is that, this is my contribution, that this takes place in my work by focusing on the potential contribution of design to the struggles for territory and cultural difference by especially Afro-descendant indigenous communities, but also peoples in urban areas in Latin America. And this then is the design of autonomy towards the pluriverse. And I will talk about that in the second half of the lecture. Okay, let me see how I'm doing with time, and if I need to start skipping some of the slides. Okay, this is just a very clunky representation of what a map of cultural stories of design might be. So we have, obviously, design takes place within this global capitalist system, patriarchal capitalist, colonial rules holder, but it's about, takes place, everything emerges from the pluriverse, and the pluriverse is the unceasing flow of life out of the dynamics of material energy and through self-organization. Life is always being created and recreated, and humans create worlds within the world, within that pluriverse in a way. And main contributors to these cultural stories of design today, which is a field that is just emerging, is being mapped today implicitly, and I'm trying to do it explicitly, is precisely anthropology and ethnography. There's a lot about anthropological design and design anthropology, geography, sociology, communications, critical theory. Political ecology is a very important field in these cultural stories of design that I'm trying to map. And obviously, the questions about ontological design. And so why ontology? And this is, for me, the best intuitive way to convey the sense for why adopt an ontological approach. This is from Winograd and Flores. We encountered the deep question of design when we recognized that in designing tools, structures, objects, etc., we are designing ways of being. I mean, if we think deeply, I could carry you through the details of these arguments, but I don't have the time to do it. But intuitively, it makes sense. The iPhones is a way of being through design. How society engenders inventions whose existence in turn alters that society. So we engender all these inventions from the train, the railroad, to the telephone, and they change the society in which those inventions are made and introduced. Today with digital technologies, obviously, even more clearly. And this wonderful expression by Australian design thinker Anne-Marie Willis that talks about the double movement of design. That design designs. We design our world, and our world designs us back. So we know how humans produce the world. I mean, social theory is about that, about the creation of the world through structures of power and discourse and domination, all these different things. But we haven't thought too much about how those worlds design us back and what are the consequences of being enmeshed in that double movement of design. Why is this ontological? I don't think you can see, most of you probably cannot see in the back, but anybody recognizes this, what this may be? Those of you who are in the front? Let me get some water. It's a urban grid, one of the famous ones. This is Barcelona. This is the new Eixample, the expansion of Barcelona out of the Gothic quarters in the 1860s by this famous architect, Ildefonso Cerdà. Compared with the Gothic, I cannot scream too much. Compared with the Gothic quarter in Barcelona and the way of being, a lot of people have written about this. This is a wonderful text by Michel Desserteau about walking in a city. If you existing in an urban design like the Gothic quarter, that was a design of sorts as well, versus existing in the Eixample or existing in the grid, the urban grid today in Washington, D.C., Brasilia, the famous planned cities of the world, is a very different ontological, economic, cultural, political feature. The American suburb. American suburb is a design. I mean, this is the classic home with two garages, and you go into the garage, you don't see your neighbors, etc., etc. Compared to this is one of the most striking examples that I give. This is a collective long house in the Amazon region. This is an artist's representation. Again, you probably don't see too much in the back, but it's a long house. It's a structure where 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 80, even 80 people live together in one single space. And they cohabitate fine, without problem. And there are rules, of course. It's not that there aren't really rules. There are rules. But this grounds a way of being and an ontology that is in tune with the earth, in tune with the natural world, in which the communal aspect of life is probably excessively so, if you wish, but it's there, it's the center of social life, as opposed to the American suburb, where it's all about individuals that don't see each other, that don't know each other, connected to the market, connected to jobs, and so forth. So these are two very different designs that create two different ways of being. So these are examples for me of why design is ontological. Sometimes I say sort of jokingly, give me a suburban home, and I will raise a world that is made up of individuals transacting in markets, the liberal world, the world of liberalism, the autonomous individual. Give me a maloca, a lone house, and I will raise a relational world. Today is all about relationality, as we're going to see in a moment. Another example, I'm just going very quickly over this. Obviously, your iPhone devices, our handheld devices, where this is from Gibson Graham's latest book, Taking Back the Economy, how our handheld devices put us in touch with the really difficult situations in Africa, in Latin America, where most of the metals, the tungsten, the gold, the tantalum, the lithium, and so forth come, so that we do have bits of Africa in our hands and bits of African blood in our hands, because this is about the civil wars in the Congo and all these different things. So this is about way of being, but also, and I'm not going to read this is about how culturally the technology constructs us as humans, our bodies, ourselves, our identities. This is from an African-American rapper, Prince Iya. You'll find it easily. The title of the video is, Can Humanity Autocorrect? It's a very nice done video, music video, in which he says, well, technology is supposed to make us connected, but really it's isolating us. Facebook is not really social technology, social network, but an anti-social network. So let's think about what we're doing. And of course, I'm always reminded that activists in Colombia with whom I work, all of them have to have cell phones because they communicate to WhatsApp. Now, today, it's become essential for activists as well. But nevertheless, that the ontological consequences of living with such a central technology as these digital devices, the average person supposedly spends at least 4 hours a day with looking at their thing, that is changing the way in which we're humans. The historical way of being human is a historical way connected to place. There's always been movement, migration, et cetera, but for the most part, the place dimension of human existence, the here and now that Paul Virilio talks about, is being erased, is being sort of undermined at the service of this delocalization, a global delocalization. And it's in reaction to this global delocalization that the new movements for localization, relocalization, recommunalization, in all transition movements, like the transition town initiatives that many of you have heard about, probably in the UK and other parts of Europe, are also reacting against. So it's a struggle about the meaning of being human as well. So the question is, if the ontological approach to design, the approach that looks at design as creating ways of being, particular ways of being, connected to economies and markets and capitalism and these different things, is an important question. It becomes this, whether design can be reoriented from this rationalist and dualist ontology in which it has been immersed, so as to become a tool or an element for autonomous and territorial struggles. So with this, I'm beginning the second part of the presentation. So beginning with that, again, the ontological project is breaking away from these dualisms of modernity, the dualism between human and non-human, mind and body, subject-object, us and them, reason and emotion, and the ontological turn. So many of you have heard the concept of ontological turn in social theory. Is precisely a way to deal with these dualisms and to move beyond the dualisms. Again, moreover, and this is something that I heard from a Mapuche shaman, woman shaman and poet, that maybe ontological design can be a space for us to learn again how to be living beings in the world today. living beings. I mean, we don't know how to be living beings, good living beings anymore. We live, let alone good humans. We live against the earth. We devastate the earth. We devastate each other. And so how can we relearn how to be living beings? And whether design ontologically understood, I'm going to shift with that. So, second part, how does we put together these two things, design, and even in its critical connotations, or rethinking design ontologically, and the territorial struggles of Latin American social movements. We'll start with a quote from an indigenous movement, which is a really amazingly lucid and radical indigenous movement in southwest Colombia, in the northern Cauca region, called the Nasa people. And they start by talking, it's a movement that started to recovering lands, a second wave of recovering of lands in the 1970s that have been taken away from them by local landholders, most to plant sugar cane and other things. And so they explain this process. They relaunched their struggle to recover lands in 2008 and then in 2014 again. And they say, who would have believed it? Heart and the earth are one single being. The heart and the earth are one single being. Again, it's telling about interconnectedness and interdependence. And that's the key concept towards which I'm going to be moving in this second half of the lecture. Looking at it clearly, we are left but one path, autonomy. But we cannot live autonomy without territory. And there cannot be territory without the Mother Earth. The struggle out of Northern Cauca is out of Northern Cauca and not from or for Northern Cauca or the Nasa people. Every freed form here or anywhere in the world is a territory that adds up to reestablish the equilibrium of Umakiwe, Mother Earth. It is our common house, our only one. There it is. Yes, come in, the door is open. So let's try to go in, accept the invitation of this group of activists from NASA people, of going in and looking at what they mean by this statement of the liberation of Mother Earth. And first, obviously, understand a bit about what's driving them out. It's the forces of expulsions. The new book by Saskia Sassen called Expulsion deals very nicely with this phenomenon, displacement, expulsion, occupations. And this is of oil palm in the southern part of the Pacific. I think Tony mentioned that in part of my work. And so before there were Afro-Colombian communities there was a rainforest, there were mangrove forests, and now is 30,000 hectares of land devoted to palm oil. There is a plantation, a Chinese plantation in the Congo that has 2.8 million hectares. Before, at the expense again of rainforests and peoples living in those rainforests, it's unbelievable, that reconversion, that ontological occupation. As the NASA indigenous leader says, not only do they get people out of the territory when they displace them to plant the palm, they get the territory out of the people. They get out of the people the ability to live territorially, to live a place-based relational existence in interdependence with the natural environment. Sugar cane, in most of the region where I grew up, that has been the main strategy for ontological occupation. So a plantation is not only a strategy for displacement and for occupying people's territories and for land grabbing. There is the ontological dimension of land grabbing, which is that they occupy, there's another world-making project, another ontology that is occupying people's ontologies and worlds that existed there before. The locals, especially the black sugarcane cutters, call them the green monster, the green monster. Okay. Again, the NASA people, the liberation of Mother Earth, for them, the central principle of the struggle becomes the liberation of Mother Earth. But we say, as long as we continue to be indigenous, in other words, children of the earth, which is everybody, that our mother is not currently free for life, but she will be when she returns to being the soil and collective home of the peoples that take care of her, respect her, and live with her. As long as it is not this way, neither will we be free. As long as the earth is enslaved, so we are enslaved. All people are slaves along with the animals and only with the animals and all beings of life, as long as we do not achieve that our mother recovers her freedom. So they have launched this very lucid radical project of the liberation of Mother Earth that includes the takeover of lands and the recuperation of lands. So neoliberal globalization from this perspective is precisely a war on anything collective, on everything that is relational. And so the question becomes, how do we rethink design under conditions of ontological occupation? And that's what I'm going to be talking about. One of the struggles that I know very well from small black town south of the city of Cali in the northern Cauca region as well is against defending the territory against gold mining companies coming to claim rights on their lands. And this is a struggle mostly led by women. They had a march in Bogota, from Cauca to Bogota was like 3 weeks marching. And this is one of their slogans of the march: because our love for life is stronger than our fear of death, territories and life are not sold, they are loved and defended. Territories and life are not sold, they are loved and defended. So it's again, there's a different kind of ontology going on here. The territories is not defending just as a source of livelihoods even, although that is an important part of it, but as a way of life, as a way of being, as a different way, as a different project of world making. More theoretically, what is this interdependence? Key concept for me is that life is interrelational interdependence through and through. We can see it intellectually. As ecologists, we know that. Ecology is the science of interdependence, interconnections of everything with everything. The key definition is nothing pre-exists the relations that constitute it. Each one of us is constituted. We do not pre-exist the relations that make us up. And we could go in a detailed analysis of why is that so. We could do the ethnography of ourselves as how we have become the kinds of beings that we have become through all these kinds of interdependencies and interconnections. And it would be a very interesting exercise that we don't have the time to do here. So theoretically, we see it. In the practice, it's so difficult to internalize it and to really live again, learn how to live again with the awareness of interconnectedness and interdependence. So there's a lot in ecological anthropology about this. I'm going to skip over this. And what we are seeing today, in many struggles today in Latin America and other parts of the world, against extractivism in particular, against the destruction of territories and communities by large-scale corporations, legal or illegal, and so forth, is the political activation of relationality as non-dualist ontologies. Again, I'm using here an ontological idiom that it would take more time to spell out, but the basic idea is that these other worlds, like the worlds of indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants, but not only them, we find this also in urban areas. And we can talk a little bit more about this in the question and answer period if you wish, because I'm not going to elaborate on that here, is live with this awareness and practice of interdependence and interconnection of everything with everything, which is the logic of nature, the logic of the world. Okay. So the argument is that some ethno-territorial struggles are struggles for the defense of other life models, are ontological struggles. They interrupt the global project of fitting all worlds into one. The global project of fitting all worlds into one, a giant global civilization, a giant capitalist market-driven economy. So the interruption of that project comes from these ontologically oriented struggles, and that these struggles are crucial for the transitions towards a world where many worlds fit, And that's the definition of the pluriverse by the Zapatista. This is a slogan from the Zapatista. They say, what we want is a world where many worlds fit. This idea of a single world of neoliberal globalization. And that's a good definition of the pluriverse. And they constitute a fundamental domain for the search for alternative models of life, economy, and society. So there's another design, in a way, in these struggles that is taking these struggles. Now, the second part, so in thinking about design with communities and from the perspective of communities, I came across two very important concepts. Three very important concepts. The first one is the concept of interdependence and interconnections, relationality. We call it relational ontologies, non-dualist ontologies. Okay? They are not based on the separation between humans and non-humans, etc., etc. Although they have to live with those separations as well today. The second concept was the concept of autonomy, and the third concept is the concept of the communal. And the communal, I'll just say a couple of things about this, is a concept that is experiencing a rebirth, a re-emergence in Latin American critical scholarship and activism, especially along with autonomy, out of places like southern Mexico, Oaxaca and Chiapas, southwest Colombia, north del Cauca, in some places in Argentina, in Ecuador, in Peru, in Peru and Bolivia, out of indigenous struggles in particular. And so there's a lot of interest in theorizing again the communal. And it's not community as we traditionally understood it. So it's a very historicized, anti-essentialist notion of the communal. You have to take my word with it. I cannot really go into detail. I can give you the names of people that are writing about this. This is still mostly in Spanish, but it's beginning to surface in English as well. Mostly scholars and activists in Mexico, Colombia, and other countries. And actually the word that they use is comunalidad, communality. Communality is the fact of being communal, as something that is central to the human experience of many of the communities, at least in Latin America. And they are connected with social movements, but more than social movements, with societies in movement. In a way, the period of insurrectionary politics that led to the election of Evo Morales as president of Bolivia in 2005, 2006, was a society movement, but it's not only a society movement, it's a world in movement, it's a different ontology movement. It's an indigenous world. It's a popular indigenous world that mobilized on the basis of partially, not completely, non-liberal, non-state, non-capitalist forms of the economy and society and social organization, and for the defense of territory, place, and culture. Of course, we have to make the caveat that we're talking about actually existing communities. These are communities that exist also already, all within global modernity and global capitalism. But the key sentence here, the concept here, is that while they are influenced and shaped in many ways by capitalism and modernity and globalization, they are not completely defined by them. So there is something that exceeds their being defined and determined by global capitalist modernity and so forth. And that which exceeds is that relational fabric of life that many of them continue to protect. Some of the most interesting scholars, like Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui in Bolivia, Veronica Gago in Argentina, talk about these sort of motley societies, neo-transnational communities. There's communities that combine and weave together the modern with the non-modern in very interesting way, markets and non-markets, capitalist economies with non-capitalist economies. So all of this is there. I always liked this saying by the Zapatista, who are very wise about all these different things, and it says, we will walk the same path, tradition if you wish, but we will not repeat it. We are from before, but we're also new. So it's that amazing dialectical combination and weaving together of the traditional with what is not, or the modern with what is not, that defines these communities. And that can be a design space. So a couple of things about autonomy, because I think I'm going to have to go a little bit faster here, and I'm going to be leaving out, I have about 10 minutes left, leaving out a section of the presentation that I forgot to mention at the beginning that probably I was going to have to leave it out, which is the section on political ontology. I'll I'll mention it when we get there. But so autonomy, and this is a Latin American theorization of autonomy, is not really the Italian Marxist theorization of autonomy that is more well known internationally and also in the US. It's a tradition of thinking about autonomy that comes from working with social movements. And again, the principle or the goal of that autonomy is the realization of the communal, meaning by that the creations of the conditions for the continued self-creations of the communities at the kinds of worlds that they are, and they have been, and that they are, and they want to continue to be. This is from a biologist, Francisco Varela, super interesting biologist, that says, the key to autonomy is that a living system find its way into the next moment by acting appropriately out of its own resources. When we think about that, it applies to anything. I mean, we find our way to our next moment of our lives out of our own resources. So in that sense, we're autonomous beings. A community also, supposed to always be important. Development was precisely about breaking down that autonomy. And I think that, as Tony mentioned, development was about bringing in, supposedly, everything that the community lacked or needed, as opposed to trying to find from within the communities themselves what is there that can be activated to continue with the production of the communities from within in an autonomous fashion. Okay. Okay, some principles for autonomous design. So in the last part of the book, what I do is try to connect autonomy and design and create this category that seems to be an oxymoron, autonomous design, because how can you design autonomy? I mean, if autonomy is an exercise, it's a political practice, it's a cultural political practice. But the wager is, going back to Manzini's quote at the beginning, that today every single individual and community is thrust into designing both traditionally, if you wish, and non-traditionally, their existence and their lives, that then we have to think about the possibility of design for autonomy. This comes from something that I did in Colombia in the late 90s, actually, some of this. And the beginning is that every community practices the design of itself. Every community practices the design of itself. We can apply it to each of us. Each of us practice the design of ourselves. Initially, we can say historically, we had this debate in Colombia with activists and students, PhD students in anthropology in particular, about do communities design? Do traditional communities like indigenous communities design? Or they just do. They just live. And they live their worlds, and they create their worlds, and they make meaningful worlds. So it's a debate that is an important debate. But I think, again, my argument is that we can no longer just rely on those traditional ways of just doing, but we have to incorporate in some fashion some more explicit technology of design. Okay. What is it that the community designs? I mean, when they are confronted with an extraction problem, with a mining operation, with the contamination of the rivers, with displacement. What they do first, they get together, and really what they do is design an inquiring or learning system about themselves. What is it that is causing the situation in which they are? And that's the beginning of a design process. And as designers, from outside, we can become co-designers, co-researchers with the community in those processes, design processes. But it is the community itself that investigates its own situation and then problematics. Autonomous design embraces ancestrality. It's something that stems from the ancestral fabric, life, practice of the communities. And the concept of ancestrality is super important for Latin American social movements, especially ethnic and some peasant social movements. But it orients itself toward the future, so towards what Tony Fry, the Australian designer that I mentioned, calls futurality. That is very important. And this is again from one of the woman leaders of the Afro-Colombian movement that says, it's sort of counterintuitive too. The essence of ancestrality is looking towards the future. So we go back to the past to the mandate of the ancestors, but only in order to make sure that we have a future with futures, with the kinds of futures that we want to maintain, not a future that wants to be imposed on us by global capitalism and so forth. Some principles of autonomous design, some most principles. So there's a lot about the design of planes de vida. In Latin America, indigenous communities, peasant communities don't talk about development plans anymore. They talk about planes de vida, especially planes de vida for the buen vivir. And planes de vida for the buen vivir. Buen vivir is a concept. I'm going to have to leave out that part of the presentation as well, which I have a few slides about buen vivir here. It's something that is more well known already. It's surfacing in English. It's a big debate, especially in the Andean context of South America, about buen vivir, which is sort of a collective well-being, is a more holistic notion of social life. It's seen not as a replacement of development, it's an alternative to development. It's precisely about getting rid of development altogether, and how do we think about social life in a holistic manner that involves the economic, the cultural, the social, and the spiritual, which is very important and increasingly important for activists that are bringing up the spiritual dimension of social life into the picture. And so that these planes de vida are planes de vida for the buen vivir, and they're very contradictory in many ways. You can analyze them for the contradictions as well. And it's about place building, it's about relocalization, it's about recommunalization. It's about articulating buen vivir with the rights of nature, which is another important thrust in Latin American social movements, practice and theory. It obviously takes into account the interaction between communities and heteronymous, sort of external social actors, like the markets and technology in particular, but always from the perspective of preserving and enhancing the community's autopoiesis. Autopoiesis is the term for self-creation, the community's self-creation, the community's autonomy. So again, it's about maintaining the autonomy of the community and maintaining the realization of the communal as a historical possibility. And has as its main goal, autonomous design, the realization of the communal, understood as the creation of the conditions for the community's ongoing self-creation and successful articulation, if you wish, with globalized environments. So again, it's about communities being able to contribute to continuing being the kinds of communities that they are, the kinds of worlds that they are, and that they want to continue to be. This is sort of my summary, again, it's sort of a clunky diagram for now of my summary of this part of the presentation, which is, of course, all design takes place in the background of the Earth, the natural systems, and the Earth's self-organization, emergence, and complexity, and autopoiesis. If we're interested in design for the defense and construction of territories and places from the perspective of autonomy, we do it by relying also as much on the ancestrality that activists emphasize so much. And in the case of the Afro-Colombian activists I work with, ancestrality and the mandate of the ancestors is very, very important, but oriented towards the future, towards post-development, going beyond development, and buen vivir, and the rise of nature, and the life plans or the life projects of the community. And finally, sort of this dialectic of moving away from structure and sustainability of the modern capitalist project towards something that Tony Fry calls the sustainment. The sustainment is just an openly sort of visualized era, also called the Ecozoic era by Thomas Berry, a North Carolina ecologist and theologian, super fascinating character, that coined this concept of the Ecozoic era, or the era of the house of life, that I'm going to define in a moment. And that's sort of the very simple way in which I've been trying to conceptualize this. I'm going to skip over this. I'm going to skip over buen vivir and modernity. We can go back to that, if you wish, in the question and answer period, because my time is nearly up, so I'm just going to move to the conclusion. Okay, So we're talking about the transition to post-extractivism, very important in Latin America. It's a design issue. How do we design post-extractivist economy? We have the work of Eduardo Godinez here, very important. Tony's own work on extractivism, I think is very important in connection to this as well. And the Ecozoic era, defined by Thomas Berry as a transition from the period when humans were a disruptive force on planet Earth to the period when humans become present to the planet in a manner that is mutually enhancing. How do we learn to live with the Earth in a mutually enhancing manner? Because we're living against the Earth today, and again, against each other. Second criteria for this kind of design work, the idea that the Earth, this is from Thomas Berry, it's a beautiful sentence from Thomas Berry, the Earth is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. So again, moving from the dualism of humans, non-humans, subject, object, the Earth as a community of subjects, and finally, the liberation of modern Earth as the single most important criteria for me, almost for anything we do. I mean, I myself don't have a problem seeing myself adopting the liberation of Mother Earth as the main principle of what I do. Conclusions? Maybe let me just read them very quickly. It's just 2 slides, 2 minutes. This ontologically oriented design first recognizes that we're both design and designing subjects. We are all designers and we are all design. That's the ontological condition. It's a strategy for significant transitions towards the pluriverse. It embraces ontologically futuring practices, particularly those involving the bringing into being or relational, non-dualist, interdependent worlds. It challenges the hegemonic category of the human, anthropocentrism, while striving for a post-human practice that questions the civilizational transition, that raises the question of civilizational transitions. In transition discourses, and I've been analyzing transition discourses for almost 10 years, there's a huge gamut of these discourses about transitions, mostly by people outside of the academy. So that's why they don't figure in the academy. Activists, ecologists, environmentalists, feminists, spiritual leaders, all kinds of people writing about these transitions away from the dying paradigm of the Western civilizational paradigm to a new set of paradigms, because it's not going to be just one, it's going to be many. It's not about expanding the range of choices, like in liberal freedom, but about transforming the kinds of beings that we desire to be. And in this sense, it's potentially non-capitalist or post-capitalist and non-liberal. It's about disoñación. This is a category invented in Colombia in the 1980s, mostly by environmental activists and indigenous activists that started to talk about how do we design our dreams, how do we embed designs with dreams, with utopias. It's a beautiful, beautiful concept. This sort of the utopia of design from this perspective. Design in this sense does not transform the world. It is rather part of the world transforming itself. It is part of the world transforming itself. So design ceases to be an expert project brought from the outside for a client or a community, and it becomes part of sort of engaging from the inside of the pluriverse, of the pluriversal flow of life with the communities in how do we go about transforming these very difficult situations. This is my own sort of definition that I came up with. Design can be seen as an open invitation for everybody, not just for communities in the global south. Everybody. We are all in this together. We're all in this earth. We're all in the pluriverse. The pluriverse is everything. We're all interconnected and interdependent on that. To become mindful and effective weavers of the mesh of life. Mindful means connected, attuned to the earth, and attuned to each other in a deep, profound way, in a way that acknowledges that everything exists because everything must exist. Again, easy to see theoretically, very difficult to bring it into practice, socially and personally. And finally, I'll leave you with another, again, NASA from the indigenous people from Colombia. This is why we fight for Earth. This is why the fight for the Earth is not only a duty for indigenous peoples, It is an ancestral mandate for all of the peoples of the world, for all women and men who want to defend life. There it is. Yes. Come in. The door is open. Thank you.
Should I start? Okay. So first of all, welcome. When I was an undergrad, we were using Dick Pete's book, and I read when we read the post-development chapter, you were there, and I thought that wow, Escobar is so cool. And now it's an honor to listen to you. I'm working on the Kurdish question in Turkey, so whatever you say is really relevant to my own research. When you were talking about the principles, though, your first two principles, rather than being principles, sounded a little bit like assumptions to me.
Like what?
Assumptions, rather than being principles. What you said was every community practices the design of itself, and the second one, an inquiring and learning system about itself. That was something. We need to go back to the slide, but anyway. And then, you know, you end up with saying we are all designers. That's basically, I think that's my question. Are we? Because if we are all designers, why are we sort of having this inequality? And because the oppressor, if there is, again, if we, you know, I don't like to create another dichotomy, but if we again divide the world, oppressor and oppressed, I think the oppressor has sort of a capacity to avoid the oppressed to learn about itself. It creates a history, it creates a geography, it creates the community itself, and you are not capable of practicing your own potential anymore, I think. So, can you elaborate on that a little bit? Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, I wasn't sure if there was. Is it? Okay. Hi.
Hello.
Thank you. Also want to reiterate, it's really an honor to have you here. Thank you so much for coming up in the snow this week.
Thank you.
I have two things on my mind. They're not fully formed. I didn't. But one, thinking about design and this connection between design and the material, and thinking through when we think about design as this as being closely connected when we think about whether it's suburban homes or urban design. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more about that element of the materiality of design. I'm thinking also through some of the work on critical making, where this idea that through making you're also creating theory, which touches this ontological ideas. But if you could talk a little bit more about that materiality piece of design, which I think is particularly interesting to me. And a second question is one of the, I think I wrote down the quote here you shared of a woman in La Toma saying, territories are not sold, they're loved and defended. And when you say, certainly the term loved, to me at least, brings up notions of care and perhaps empathy. We have a colleague here at Clark who's thought a lot about the notion of empathy, and I wonder if those terms ring at all for you in thinking through this design work, and if you could talk a little bit about that. Thank you.
One more. Sorry.
Why don't you go ahead with these two?
Okay. I have my reading glasses on, so I don't know if anybody was raising their hands or not. Okay, the question about, and this is, my answer is probably out of ignorance, but I've been reading really interesting things about the connection between the Kurdish movement and, for instance, the Zapatista movement. So you're probably aware of that, and how these two movements have made, for instance, of de-patriarchalization of society a very important goal. So that's, again, is something that we're not accustomed to thinking, that traditional communities change. I mean, the idea of a static, non-changing community was an invention of anthropology. In the 1930s, 1940s anthropology, communities have always been changing, and they are definitely open to change. And this idea to me of depatriarchalization, which is an idea that decolonial feminists in Latin America and in other parts of the world are making the center part of their writing and struggles. The idea that there cannot be decolonization without depatriarchalization is a very important one. So I don't know if that part was part of the background of your question, but yes. But then your question is really, I mean, do the designs of the powerful, do they not render impossible and inoperative the designs of the weak, so to speak? Do they not, in their occupying, their expulsion and occupying, ontological occupation of people's lives and territories, render that impossible? And my answer is yes and no, and goes back to the question of hope. Yes, in the sense, at least what I've learned from these activists in Colombia that I've been working with, is that, and the recent decision of the Zapatista might be a good entry into your question. The Zapatista, who have always been opposed to participating in politics, and one of whose main slogans is that we don't want to take power but to change the world. So we don't want the state is not where power is at, we're not interested in that, have now changed their position and say they are going to participate in the upcoming national elections in 2018. But they're going to participate not only in any way, they have created a coalition with the national coordination of indigenous peoples, and they have chosen an indigenous woman as their candidate for the next presidential elections, or they are going to choose her. I think she has chosen already. And the rationale is why, and this is part of the answer to your question, and the reason why they say why they decided to do that is precisely because the state, the Mexican state, in the crisis in which it is increasingly crushing any possibility of any condition that is auspicious, or there is how do you say, constructive for communities to continue to advance their projects, their political projects, and their struggle. So in that context, they say, I mean, it's becoming pure annihilation of indigenous peoples, peasants, and so forth. So in that context, they say we have to go to contest the power of the state. Not to take power again, but to contest it and to contribute to opening up a new design conversation, if you wish, nationally and internationally about what's going on in Mexico, so that communities have at least a small margin of possibility for continuing to press on with the political projects, which is their life projects, which is the design project, if you wish, for a different kind of world, for a pluriverse, for a world made up of many different worlds. So on the one hand, we have like two designs, opposing design imaginations. We have the design imagination of what John Law, a British sociologist, calls it the one world. That's a great compact formulation, and he has a very short article that defines that very well. Is the world made up of a single world, which is the world of, sort of Euro-American capitalism modernity, patriarchal capitalism modernity, and so forth, that has arrogated for itself, with colonialism and neo-colonialism and now globalization, to create a single world under the rules of sort of the Euro-American cosmology, philosophy, and so forth. So on the one hand, we have that, and imposed, and this is what is interesting about Saskia Sassen's new book, when she says that the results of that imposition of that single view of the world is brutal simplicity, is brutal expulsions, is brutal displacement, is brutal domination. It's a new kind of primitive accumulation, if you wish. But that's the result of an extremely complex new system of rule. So she talks about systemic complexity and the brutality of effects, simple brutal effects coming out of that tremendous complexity that we don't have the lenses, the categories to analyze well anymore. That's her argument. And so that design, nobody's designing that. I mean, it's a sort of a designerless strategy of global capitalism, although there are key places where explicit design strategies have been put into place, obviously, is counterposed with these pluriverse designs, planes de vida, forms of resistance, post-extractivist social orders and so forth, imaginations that are coming out from the global south. But your question is very well taken. I mean, you can say, well, it's a losing battle. What I learned from the activists in Colombia is that even in the context of the most dire conditions, you cannot not struggle, and you cannot not engage. Because the state, again, the state as a design machine regulates the conditions on which people have to live their lives and the conditions under which people are being massacred and destroyed. So that's as much as I can tell you for now, but I think that's a very important question. I think Tony Fry is working on that in a very interesting way as well, especially in one of his latest books, which is called City Futures in the Age of a Changing Climate. The second question about materiality. Materiality is critical to design. I mean, design is about materiality. I mean, it's about, you can design discourses, narratives, imaginations, that's part of design as well. But design has always been the interconnection, the articulation between a materiality, plastic, wood, metal, minerals, form, whatever form you give to that, and function. And the function might be, many different kinds of function in so-called modern life. So the materiality is critical, and it's a materiality that has been conceived out of a very sort of dualistic ontology. The material is sort of inert still, so now in this new way of thinking about materiality, we have to grant and recognize that objects, things, are in a way have some sort of agency, and this comes from Latour, but it comes from many other people, comes from what is called materialist ontologies today. These materialist ontologies are vibrant things that Jane Bennett, political philosopher, talks about, how to give back to things the thinghood that they have, as opposed to continue to see them as purely inert things that humans can use. So from all of this all the materialist ontology, we can think about the materiality differently. And we can think about human and non-human entanglements, assemblages, and about these kinds of assemblages of humans and non-humans that many people now are sort of focusing on ethnographically as well. It is very much linked to the questions to the notion of love and care. And care is a language that, as we know, is a prominent concept from feminist economics initially and then feminist scholarship, but also from liberation theology. Liberation theologians have talking about care for quite a while as well. In the work of Humberto Maturana and co-workers, Chilean biologists working with other people, which is all about the biology, what he calls the biology of love. And the biology of love is what they discover as biologists and psychologists, is that love is not a moral conception of love, it's a biological conception of love. Love is the foundation of human existence. It's the foundation of life, or even human, it's the foundation of life. It's the foundation of evolution. It has to do with new ideas about how evolution actually takes place as well, and that we have imposed on that biology of love, we have imposed an ontology of war and control and hierarchy, especially with the development of patriarchy 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. So patriarchy now is reinterpreted as this ontology of domination, control, hierarchy, appropriation, etc., that is steadily replaced the more matriarchal ontologies based on cooperation and love and solidarity and interdependence and interconnection and a place for the spiritual and the natural and so forth. And so how to bring back an ethics of love and an ethics of care, and how to do it with a new conception of the material and of things and of objects and of things even that are alive. I mean, the work of Marisol de la Cadena, which I think is a very good example about this, especially in this last book called Earth Beings. And in Earth Beings, she focuses on one particular case that is a wonderful case in the Peruvian Andes. I mean, this is very controversial and so forth, but for now I'll give you this version, which is that there is a resistance to mining projects around a mountain called Ausangate in the Peruvian Andes, because the local peasants, sometimes indigenous peasants, consider to be some sort of sacred being. The sacred being, she discovers in her ethnography, is our concept, is our term for something that is much more complex, because something that is more complex that belongs to an interdependent, an ontology of interdependence, in which the mountain and humans and runas and white people and everybody else and all of nature are part of this sort of the single world and the single universe, are part of this pluriverse in which the divisions between the humans and the non-humans, although they are present, they don't operate in the same way as they operate for us moderns, but there is more fluidity and entanglement. So it's the assemblage between humans and non-humans that now has to be thought about and defended. So she says, how, if we want to take serious this idea that these groups are defending the mountain because the mountain is a sacred being or a spiritual being, what are the consequences for our notions of science, politics, and the like? And the analysis says that the consequences are really very fundamental. We have to change our notion of politics to include non-humans. So what is the politics, the agency of non-humans? How do we take that into account? But the notion of science also has to change to talk about other ways of thinking about knowledge and about science. And so how to construct these new kinds of assemblages, if you wish. I'm not sure I like the concept of assemblages too much, but for now it's an interesting concept between humans and non-humans and the spiritual beings and so forth, as opposed to these dualistic worlds we have constructed in which humans are separate from nature and so forth. So that's what I might say for now.
So it's 8:30, and our church has been standing and calling for a long time, and I'm conscious of that. So I'd like, and it's going to be tomorrow morning from 10 to 11:30. So I think, unless somebody has a really burning question, I would really like to give him a chance to drink and relax a little bit, and we can continue the conversation.
Any final question? Burning question? Anybody? One here. All right, go for it. Noise, please. Oh my God.
Interim. Okay, I had a longer question, but I'll save that for tomorrow. So I guess I'm struggling with the choice of the term design because it's so modernist and teleological. So can you just respond to that?
Yes, excellent question. And that's the same resistance to the use of this term by some of my friends, including Marisol de la Cadena, Mario Blase, Enrique Lev, Gustavo Esteban, and say design, but why call it design? My counterintuitive response, maybe a reversal, is the following, is which category is modernist? I mean, do we go back to talking about the social, the cultural, the political, history? All of those are sort of Eurocentric categories. So there is no way out, it seems. And that was a debate about do communities design or not? Are we not imposing a new category on communities that never thought about design themselves? So there is an emergent subfield, which in these critical design studies, which is called designs from the South, or for the South, or with the South. And so one of the concepts that I found interesting from this literature on design from the South is the concept of design by other names or by other means. So we have a conversation, for instance, with some Amazonian sort of elders from the Amazon, the Colombian Amazon, and we ask them, well, you know, do you think what you do is design? I mean, they have such an amazing, sophisticated knowledge, not only about the part of the territory in which they live, and this knowledge has been lost, it's true, but about the Amazon basin as a whole. Traditionally, there's a knowledge of the Amazon basin as a whole of places that most of them have never been to, but collective is the collective knowledge among sort of the elders of the Amazon. And that creates principles for the design of communities, the houses, the practices, the fishing practices, the hunting practices, the growing food practices, the spiritual practices, ritual practices. So in a way, it's like a lived thought, because there's a thought, there's a pensamiento. And the Spanish concept of pensamiento, I think it's freer, maybe, than the language, the English concept of thought or thinking. I don't know if Tony, who knows well both languages, might agree or not, if he wants to say something about that. But pensamiento, there's a pensamiento of the pueblos. There's a sentipensar, even. There's a new concept that people use. Sentipensar, a thinking, feeling with the earth. So we sentipensamos con la tierra, we think, feel with the earth. Because it's a thought that is not based entirely on the separation between mind and body. It's not detached, although sometimes it is detached as well, but it's more an embodied kind of knowledge and reflection. So we had this conversation with them and with a designer, a Colombian designer. Well, do you think they design? And this Amazonian sort of elder sort of didn't quite answer the question, although the Colombian designer, who is not indigenous, said, of course they design. I mean, what they do is they design the world. There's no other way to say it. They have thought. It's not that they don't think. I mean, they have a very sophisticated thought. So that's one question. And yes, design is teleological, it's functionalist, it's modernist, and all these different things. It's very much centered to planning, which has been, you know, what more modern is political technology than planning? Development is about planning too. Development is a design project. But my feeling is that how can we then reclaim, and is it worth our trouble to reclaim design? And it's a hypothesis, for now it's a hypothesis. I present it as a hypothesis that yes, it can be reclaimed, but to reclaim it, we really have to go back into a new awareness of the historicity of design in the rationalistic tradition, the Cartesian tradition from which design comes out, in the modernist practice of modernism, and so forth, in its entanglement with capitalism. And then can we really extricate it and redefine it in that way? And so it's a debate. It's an important debate. So, you know, there are people that say, no, forget about design. There are people who say, wow, this is great. We have to do it. We have to go for it. It's a challenge. But thanks for the question. It's a great question.
There's another associate provost here. On behalf of Wallace,
thank you. I don't know why I got so tired from the beginning. I was tired.
That was great.
So bad. Was it clear enough?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you, Jim. Yeah.